us this afternoon. As you can see, I'm not Camilla, but she couldn't be with us today, so I hope we'll make do. But anyway, so gender identity ideology has had an extraordinary influence on public policy, practice, and discourse in a very short space of time. This has threatened and undermined established science, children's safeguarding, free speech, and women's rights to single-sex spaces, services, and sports. So in this event, we would like to explore what the Conservatives can learn from the mistakes of the past and what we should do differently in the future. So I'm joined today by Maya Forstatter, who is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Sex Matters, Fuchsia Hyde of Bayswater Support Group, Eileen Gallagher, Chair of Trustees of LGB Alliance, and Miriam Cates, the former Member of Parliament for Penistone and Stocksbridge. So without further ado, I will start with Maya. If you'd like to give some opening remarks, please.
Yes. I've been told to make it 3 minutes, so I'm going to try and make it 3 minutes. If you want more information, you can pick up our brochure. We did this for a lobby day that we did a couple of weeks ago in Parliament. We got 250 people to go and see their MPs to talk about single-sex spaces. You can pick one up from me. The problem about sex and gender and women's rights is at 3 levels. There's a problem with the law, there's a problem with the guidance, the statutory guidance and the non-statutory guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and there's a problem with practice in schools, in hospitals, in health and social care, in prisons, in police, in everywhere where sex matters. The law is not terrible. The law is pretty good, we think. So the Equality Act was built on decades and decades of anti-discrimination law. For example, the Sex Discrimination Act 1975. It brought them all together. It's a little bit messy, but it's not bad. And it protects people against sex discrimination if they're male or if they're female, and it protects people against gender reassignment discrimination if they have a trans identity. And that means that if somebody has a trans identity, they shouldn't lose their job, they shouldn't be denied housing, they shouldn't be denied banking, they should be able to participate in society, and that is right. But human beings can't change sex. The law cannot change a person's sex, and in lots and lots of situations, sex matters. A lot of times people point at the Equality Act and they say, well, the Equality Act says we have to do this, we have to treat a man as a woman. The Equality Act doesn't. The Equality Act, as Kemi Badenoch says, is a shield, not a sword. It doesn't tell you what to do, it tells you what you're not allowed to do. What you're not allowed to do is unlawfully discriminate against people. It doesn't tell you that you have to treat a man as a woman in a changing room, in a hospital ward. If that man is a police officer and has a job searching, there are rules about you should be searched by a person of the same sex. Nothing in the Equality Act overrides that. We do think there is a small problem with the Equality Act, which is where the Gender Recognition Act, which allows a very small number of people to change their sex as recorded on their birth certificate, does that change someone's sex for the purposes of the protected characteristic of sex? We think it doesn't. There's going to be a case in the Supreme Court to decide that coming up in November, but what we want is for the government to make a one-line amendment just to make it absolutely clear that sex in the Equality Act means male or female. Rishi Sunak said that he would do it, that the Conservatives would do it. They didn't do it in time. I'm absolutely furious with Rishi Sunak for not delivering this. He could have done it. Now we have to convince Labour to do it. But it is a cross-party issue, so I'm not giving up hope on that. But in terms of what Conservatives can and should do, practice is really important. There are 57, I think, Conservative-controlled councils. There are 19 Conservative police and crime commissioners. This is not just about Westminster, it's about what happens in practice in local authorities, in schools, and there's much to play for in the next 5 years.
Thank you, Maya. I think we definitely want to talk more about the Equality Act and what you'd like to see in more depth, but I will now turn to Fuchsia Hyde from Bayswater Support Group.
Good afternoon. As this panel is about safeguarding, and especially looking in review at things that we can learn and hopefully learn from and put in place better policies, I'm going to put across a few points that I myself have learned by listening to people with years of safeguarding knowledge to describe what safeguarding means and just to try and put in context why things have gone so awry. Safeguarding is a culture. It's not a tick box exercise. It doesn't make you popular. Peter Tatchell will not be your friend. You won't be invited to any glittering award ceremonies, parties, or get pats on the back. You will often be ignored and dismissed when trying to raise concerns. You may even be sacked and called names, as countless whistleblowers can attest to. Safeguarding is about cold, hard, objective evidence, about child predation and abuse from something called serious case reviews and inquiries. It's actually a close analogue of the insurance industry that works on facts, not feelings, to mitigate risks to the vulnerable and your organisation. Safeguarding needs to be understood by anyone who is responsible for children or policies that impact children. You don't necessarily need direct contact to a child to be a potential safeguarding risk. Predators often groom the adults around the child to get access, or policymakers who write policies putting boundaries in place around access. Safeguarding is the opposite of an inclusion and no judgment philosophy. It's about actively trying to exclude predators from accessing children, your organisation, and rewriting policies that protect the reputation of your organisation in order to suit their agendas, not yours. Safeguarding is about being able to say a firm no and set hard boundaries. It's about being held accountable for your decisions should those in your care be harmed. It's also about showing a healthy scepticism to outsiders to your organisation, coming in and telling you that 2 + 2 = 5. And if you don't agree, it's because you're some variation of phobic or a bigot. At the height of something called the PI, I'm assuming that everybody here knows what the paedophile information exchange was, but if you don't, I'm afraid I'm going to introduce you to the concept of something called the paedophile information exchange. And at the height of this, they infiltrated the gay movement, and that infiltration actually reached schools. And a common tactic was to shut down any criticism of dubious behaviour around children was cries of homophobia. We then saw the same with Rotherham, this time with Islamophobia. We're now all familiar with being tarred with transphobia for raising concerns around trans-identified individuals and policies. So to understand where things went wrong, it started with a failure to adhere to a safeguarding culture and instead embrace the much more socially and politically acceptable rights culture, one of special pleading, identity politics, and the term that we're all very familiar with, being kind. One that makes protecting the vulnerable much, much more difficult, is rather than saying no, that there is a conflict of rights to be managed on a case-by-case basis. It was a context whereby children were taught inclusive RSE, which instructed them that some girls had a penis and were born in the wrong body. It was also the context where schools set up LGBT clubs, where a child could go in, a bullied lesbian, and come out insisting on he, him pronouns and with a binder. It was a context whereby primary school children were taught about explicit sex acts and how to watch porn safely and ethically. It was a context whereby the Department for Education was infiltrated to the extent they allowed Nancy Kelly of Stonewall to rewrite the statutory safeguarding framework for schools, to remove children with a trans identity from safeguarding, to mandate affirmation, to keep secrets from parents about social transition, and exposing those children to profound psychological interventions and risks, despite them likely to be amongst the most vulnerable of all children by dint of their autism, ADHD, history of bullying, and other traumatic experiences frequently marked by sexual abuse. The Conservatives at the 11th hour did, to their credit, manage to course correct on some of these safeguarding failures. The Children's Safeguarding Framework, Keeping Children Safe in Education, has now had the Stonewall Clause removed and explicitly recognises that trans identity, or gender questioning child, as they refer to them, is a red flag for extreme vulnerability and often likely exploitation. So I guess going forward, hard questions will now need to be answered as to why those in charge of such policies ever let activists near them. I mean, and how on earth the Department for Education had such a poor understanding of safeguarding, given that their primary remit is to kind of have the care of a nation's children in their hands. So that's my summing up.
Thank you. Thank
Just
you.
to give us context.
Thank you. And I will now go to Eileen.
Thank you, Lottie. The LGB Alliance has a very specific purpose because we're focused on lesbian, gay and bisexual people whose rights have been under attack over the last few years. And in a crazy twist, this attack has come from the very groups, in particular Stonewall, which were set up to protect gay rights. So we believe that groups like Stonewall and Mermaids are positively damaging distressed and troubled young people who are questioning their sexuality, and in most circumstances, as the Cass review is now confirmed, they turn out to be happy lesbian, gay, bisexual people. These LGBTQ plus groups, and there are hundreds of them around the country, they're telling these young distressed people that they were born in the wrong body, as Fuchsia said, and they can change their sex with drugs and surgery. This is a medical and social scandal, and the whole of the Conservative Party needs to be united and get to grips with it. So very briefly, I'll tell you our experience working with the past Conservative government and where we think the Conservative opposition should go now. In the closing months and days of the Conservative government, we saw real positive movement to repair some of the damage caused by the gender ideology movement. It took a lot of work to impress Education Secretary Gillian Keegan that schools' guidance needed to discourage the social transitioning of children and that teachers should not use pupils' chosen pronouns. Victoria Atkins was a big improvement in Jeremy Hunt on this issue. Angie Bartlett, who's sitting right there, and I spoke at length to Vicky at Anne Jenkins' spring lunch this year, and we impressed upon her the importance of outlawing the prescription of puberty blockers at private clinics. And in a heroic effort, Vicky introduced emergency legislation on the very last day of the Conservative government, which was amazing. And of course, the Labour Party has now said they will honour that, and that's one thing that Wes Streeting has done that I think we should congratulate him on. These are just two examples, though, Victoria and Gillian, of the effort everyone in this panel has put in and an army of GC activists to move the government on this issue. But for the most part, it has to be said, the last Conservative government was too timid. They feared that the trans rights was a new Section 28, and it just isn't. So the government sat back and allowed the infiltration of institutions by trans activists pushing dangerous ideological policies. The NHS, schools, universities, the civil service all allowed unfettered access to activist groups like Stonewall and Mermaids. For me, the biggest crime was an NHS that, thanks to the Tavistock and the Sandyford in Glasgow, encouraged the fantasy that children could change their sex. And just how did it happen that a Conservative government allowed this mutilation to get done at taxpayers' expense on the NHS? So thank God for Cass, a real game changer, and thank you Sajid Javid and everyone who facilitated it. But the backlash against Cass from the trans lobby started almost immediately, and despite the new Labour government stating it's committed to Cass, I fear the activists will do all they can to undermine it. So finally, what should the Conservatives do in opposition? They need to hold the Labour government's feet to the fire, speak up and condemn any rolling back of the reforms on education and health and any watering down of Cass. They should oppose or amend the coming conversion therapy bill to ensure therapists aren't stopped from helping distressed children. They must oppose any embedding of gender ideology in the new gender clinics being set up in regional centres. Now, I think these efforts will be rewarded by hundreds and thousands of parents and grandparents who will vote for Conservatives as the only party serious about protecting women and girls and gays and lesbians from a dangerous cult that's been adopted and championed by all the other political parties.
Thank you. That is a rallying cry. And finally, I will turn to Miriam, whose work on this when you were in government was pretty tireless. So, yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Dottie. And one of the questions I was asked most often when I was an MP was, well, this happened under your watch. How did this happen under the Conservatives? And I think that's a fair question. But I think if you look around the world and see what's happened in almost all Western democracies, I think we can say that this happened in the UK despite the Conservative government. And I think if you look at countries like Canada, which have had much more left-wing governments, actually the trans rights, the trans lobby has gone much, much further than in the UK. So I'm not seeking to defend my former colleagues, and certainly there's so much more that government should have done, but I don't think it's fair to say that the Conservatives caused this. I think they didn't resist it hard enough, but I think what's happened across the world shows that this is a movement across the West, starting in academia in America. Perhaps that's a whole nother panel discussion, but I don't think we can completely blame a Conservative government for what happened. However, they were not quick enough to identify what was happening and to resist it, and I think part of that speaks to a wider failure of a crisis of identity for Conservatives, of what it means to be Conservative, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So why did it happen, and why did it happen without challenge? I think Eileen's put her finger on it. The group Stonewall had a lot of respect across the whole of the political and media class by a certain point in time, and rightly so. It fought a very strong campaign. But it pivoted very quickly into trans rights, and so understandably, MPs and the media and think tanks were confused by that and believed that this was just the next step in civil rights, and it was very socially disadvantageous to criticise Stonewall. So I think we can all understand that from a human point of view, how they managed to have such a strong case. But I think the legislation was a key part of it. Tony Blair set a lot of grenades with a lot of long fuses, and we didn't realise in 2010 when we came into government, admittedly with the Liberal Democrats, the knock-on long-term effects of acts like the Gender Recognition Act, which actually embedded the idea of sex change in law, at least in people's minds, even if not in actual fact. And of course the Equality Act, particularly the public sector equality duty, that compels public sector organisations not just to oppose discrimination, but to positively advocate for the different protected characteristics. And the problem with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment against all the others, like sex, age, pregnancy, it's the only one that is self-identified. You can't just wake up in the morning and say, I'm pregnant today, or I'm married today, or even religion. I mean, obviously you can change religion, but a court of law could look for a lot stronger evidence that you do actually follow a recognised faith, rather than saying, at some point in the future, I think I might change gender. So there's a big problem with that as a protected characteristic, because it has no basis in law or fact, it can't be objectively identified. So that's a problem. The public sector equality duty is a problem. And the government in 2010 did not recognise the long-term effects of these embedding in law, and it certainly did nothing about it. Now, you could argue that even if it had been recognised in 2010, there's no way politically it would have been possible to amend or repeal the Equality Act with the Lib Dems in government. And certainly from 2016 onwards, the government had many, many other things that it was thinking about other than reorganising our human rights law. So I'm not trying to make excuses. It was too little too late. But I think there are good political reasons for what happened. So what happens next? What should we do if we come back into government? Now, I personally think that we do need to repeal some legislation, certainly the Gender Recognition Act. I think there are many good parts of the Equality Act, as Maya said. It's certainly, a lot of it is just the amalgamation of previous law that was good, but it certainly needs re-looking at. And I think the mistake the Conservatives made over the last 14 years is we did not repeal a single aspect of Blairite legislation, which is a total mistake. The next leader has to have a programme, not just for reform, but also repeal. So I think that's something that we need to look at, and there's probably a whole load of other laws that we might want to repeal as well. But secondly, I think part of this, the panel is called What Should Be the Conservative Approach? Well, I think that speaks to the question, what does it mean to be conservative? And I think to be conservative means to have a worldview that's first of all based on empirical evidence. What can we observe about the world around us from history, from human behaviour, from fact, from science? What actually is the common sense truth that's out there? And I think looking at this issue through that lens, it's very obvious that there's a difference between men and women. All cultures, through all time, through all traditions, have recognised that, and they've all had rules and laws about separating men and women in intimate spaces. Now, some of them take an extreme oppressive approach, look at the Taliban. Some of them, Western liberal democracies, take a much more liberal approach. Only distinguishing between the sexes where sex matters, as Maya said, toilets, changing rooms, hospitals, trying to remove the barriers for women, let's say, in careers and things like that. And obviously that is our approach as a Western liberal democracy. But every civilization has recognised the difference between men and women. In fact, that's a foundation of most societies, and they've recognised that women are at risk from men and children are at risk from men. Not all men, of course, but that we need structures and boundaries in place to protect women. That's just obvious, that's just common sense, that's what being a conservative is all about. But also being conservative is about assuming that the traditions and cultures and heritage that have stood the test of time are broadly right, and that just because we've come up with an idea yesterday doesn't mean it's better than what's gone before, that change should be incremental, and we are naturally resistant to radical revolutionary change. And all our conservative alarm buttons should have gone off with the trans agenda, because it is radical, it is revolutionary, it does fundamentally undermine the basic tenets of our society that have been built up over hundreds of years of Western civilization. Why did those alarm bells not go off? Because I think, sadly, the party had ceased to be conservative, or at least to be able to articulate what it meant to be conservative. And I think the coalition with the Liberals, the way that liberal democracy has gone over the last 20 years, has very much confused the difference between classical liberalism, conservatism, all these other philosophies, and we basically need to be able to re-establish what it means to be a conservative in the 21st century, how to describe that and how to sell it. Because if we can't do that, we will not be able to resist the next movement that comes along, because there will be one.
Thank you, Miriam. I want to go back to the idea of the protected characteristics and Equality Act reform and the Gender Recognition Act, because the answer to the question, can a woman have a penis? With the GRA legally, yes, you can, right? As in, obviously you can't, but legally on a piece of paper, that is what the Gender Recognition Act does. And I don't think that people necessarily understand that that is what the protected characteristic of gender reassignment means, and enabling you to get a certificate.
Well, it's not what the protected characteristic of gender reassignment means, it's what the Gender Recognition Act means. So
Yes, okay, fine, sorry.
Sorry.
I'll leave the expert to discuss it. I want to go into more broadly the Equality Act reform, and particularly what Sex Matters would like to see. You've done an awful lot of work on this. So going forward, what would you like to see?
So, just to give you some numbers, according to the census, some 250,000 people have a transgender identity. At the time when the Gender Recognition Act was passed, the government estimated that 5,000 people had a transgender identity, and that's about the number of people who have got a gender recognition certificate. It's about the same as the kind of numbers of people that go into witness protection. So when they did it, they thought it was like witness protection. They thought it was such a tiny number of people, and they had such an extreme experience in life that you change all kinds of rules for people who go into witness protection, and that's what they thought they were doing. And so they allowed people to change the sex that's recorded on their birth certificate, and for the purposes of marriage, because at the time there wasn't same-sex marriage. That's what they thought they were doing. They didn't think they were breaking the Equality Act. They didn't really think about the Equality Act at all. But as Lottie said, it does mean that legally you can be a woman with a penis. And they just didn't think through, well, what does that mean for hospitals, for schools, for safeguarding, for all of these situations? And so what we want them to do, so when they passed the Gender Recognition Act, the House of Lords said, we've been legislating on sex for hundreds and hundreds of years. There are dozens and dozens of laws that say man and woman and male and female. And the Gender Recognition Act says this extraordinary thing. It says it will change a person's sex for all purposes. It's impossible. It can't do magic. It can change a person's sex for certain legal purposes. And then they put in exceptions already in that act. So they said it doesn't change your sex for the purposes of inheritance of a peerage or inheritance of property. It doesn't change your sex for the purposes of rape, because rape in English law is penetration by a penis. It's a crime that only a man can do, and it doesn't change your sex for the purposes of rape. And then they kind of left for all other purposes vague. It does change your sex for the purpose of marriage, it changes your sex for the purposes of pensions, and everything else was vague. And so the question that we've arrived at now, 14 years after the Equality Act, is does it change your sex for the purposes of the Equality Act? And we think the answer should be no, because only a few thousand people have this. Most transgender people don't have a gender recognition certificate. Employers, service providers, hospitals, gyms should treat people fairly, but they can't treat a trans person, they can't know if a trans person has a gender recognition certificate or not. They can't ask them if they've had surgery. Most transgender people don't have surgery. You can't ask. And so what they should be able to do is to have clear rules to say this lot, you know, the gym floor is for people of any sex, but this changing room is for men, this changing room is for women, and we have a gender neutral changing room, so everyone is accommodated. We're not going to ask you personal questions. We don't care whether you've got a gender recognition certificate or not, but we understand that for the purposes of women taking their clothes off and getting in the shower, that needs to be a female only space. Full stop. And that principle applies everywhere that sex matters. So what we want the government to do is so as I said, the House of Lords, they said we've been legislating about sex for hundreds of years. They put in a safety clause. They said if there are problems, you can use secondary legislation to basically remove the Gender Recognition Act from any other law. And you can do it with secondary legislation. The power is already there. And that's what we asked the government to do, and that's what they said they would do. The Conservative government said they were going to do it, didn't get round to it on time, so now we are asking Labour to do it, and we hope that Conservatives will get behind that, because it will make it just much simpler to be able to say sex is one thing, gender reassignment is another thing. In places where sex matters, it is sex that matters.
Thank you for explaining. I'd like to hear, Fuchsia, from you on, so obviously Cass's review was into gender distressed children and services for children. We have an issue with the adult clinics as well. And many Conservatives would say, well, you know, let adults be adults so they can make their own choices and leave them to it. What are the problems with that? Do you see problems with that? Or what do you
in terms of, I think a lot of people kind of find this quite a hard concept to understand, because there's a big perception, you know, people turn 18 and it's the ultimate marker of freedom and autonomy. However, in regards to medical care and the NHS, you don't have total freedom to go to your doctor and ask them to perform any kind of surgery or get any medication you like. And we also have to understand that there is huge ethical burden on the medical service to provide safe evidence-based care. Indeed, evidence-based medicine is one of the bedrock of the NHS, and the NICE evidence review NICE itself is seen globally as being the best marker of what is regarded as evidence-based care. So if we come to the area of trans medicine, we have to ask, one, what are they treating, and what is the evidence for this treatment? And the cupboard is pretty bare. I mean, we're all very familiar now, thanks to Cass, just how bad the evidence base is for under 18s. But given that the evidence base for adults comes from an organisation called WPATH, the evidence is just as poor for adults. And in fact, what we have found is that the best evidence shows the worst outcomes, and the more that they have got long-term objective studies into it, the more alarming the long-term prognosis is when you effectively introduce kind of opposite sex hormones and remove bodily organs. It's quite a catastrophic cascade of what is the medical term for that is iatrogenic harm, where you're kind of introducing harm to try and treat something itself. And so, I'm also very aware that there are people have been criminalised for things like doing tongue splitting or even like a castration clinic, and nobody said, well, they're over 18.
Yeah.
Surely they can choose to do
Yeah.
this if you're over 18. That's just, you know, the idea that you can consent to your own harm, and it ignores the kind of the dynamics that, you know, people, if they're consenting to their own harm, there's some vulnerabilities that need to be
Yeah.
looked at, and safeguarding does apply within the NHS. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
you know.
Okay. Thank you. And I want to go back to the issue of schools. And Miriam, I'm going to come to you on this. There's two issues in schools, as I see it. There's a safeguarding of gender distressed children and the school's approach to those children, which the Conservative government did go some way with the draft guidance of tackling that. And then there's the curriculum content. You've done a lot of work on RSHE, particularly, and gender ideology in schools. What do you think that the Conservatives got wrong? I mean, we brought in statutory RSHE and kind of mandated for this stuff in some ways. What do you think needs to happen going forward on that?
Well, honestly, I would scrap RSHE as a subject. I mean, I think...
I thought you might say that.
The problem is when the purpose of schools is to teach knowledge and skills, again, that have been established over time, so that you're teaching things that have stood the test of time. Shakespeare has stood the test of time. Somebody who wrote a book last week has not yet stood the test of time. Same with science, it's proven in fact, maths. You know, there's a canon of literature, a basic curriculum that pretty much the whole Western world agrees on because it stood the test of time. The problem with teaching anything that is actually values rather than knowledge or skills is that it is contested and that there is no knowledge, there is no expertise. So it doesn't matter whether it's citizenship, something my son's got, it's what global citizenship, what even is that? Or sex education. These are all values and opinion-based subjects where a teacher can't be expert in those in the way that they are expert in maths or science. And therefore it's immediately contested, because who says that what the teacher says is better or more true than what parents say at home, or what granny says, or what your church leader says? Who says? And yet that is now being taught to children as fact, and then next lesson they go to maths, where they absolutely are supposed to take it as fact. So how is a 12-year-old child supposed to say in one lesson, right, everything the teacher says here is fact, I must memorise it and learn it for the exam, and then the next lesson, oh, actually I'm supposed to think critically about this because this might not be true and there are many, many different views on this subject. Schools don't work like that. Teachers have to have authority, children have to believe what they're taught and trust their teachers. And the problem with any subject, whether it is citizenship, RSHE, anything like that, is that it's not knowledge-based, it is values-based, therefore it's contested and it's confusing to children. So my personal view is that we shouldn't have introduced that as a subject. Again, sex education is a, you know, if you want to look at it this way, it is a psychological experiment, because who knows what teachers teaching children about what is and isn't morally acceptable sexually is going to do to a generation of children. Yes, in biology, teach how to get pregnant, teach about baby development, teach about contraception, all those things, absolutely fact-based. But who are teachers and schools and the state to tell children what their moral values should be when it comes to sex? I just don't think that's a safe space for schools to get into. And I personally feel really sorry for schools, because they are told to taught this. A lot of very sensible teachers will do anything they can to get out of teaching PSHE, but they just download off the internet the night before something on these topics. And when Stonewall et al. Managed to get teaching gender identity into the RSHE curriculum, that was curtains really, because then teachers just had to teach it in any way they could find. So it's easy to blame schools, and there certainly are some radical teachers out there who are deliberately pushing this agenda. But there's also very many other teachers in schools who are just throwing their hands up saying, the government says we've got to teach this, Ofsted will judge us unfavourably if we don't, what do we do? Can we reform RSHE without actually getting rid of it as a subject? Possibly, I'm sure we can improve it. I think the right to withdraw your child only from the sex element needs to change, because what a lot of schools do is they teach certain things under relationships where probably common sense would tell you it's actually sex, and so therefore the parent can't withdraw their child. It's a really fascinating case that's live at the moment, a lady called Claire Page, very, very brave mother from London who was refused access to her child's sex education lessons. She's taking that all the way through to an appeal court, having lost the first judgment. So that's one to follow. It may be that if she wins her case, then essentially the law, the regulations will change. But I mean, what we did wrong was allowing a non-knowledge-based, values-based subject into schools, which should be focusing on established knowledge and skills.
Yeah. And you are also a teacher, aren't you? A former teacher.
I used to be a biology teacher. I mean, I taught sex education and I was heavily pregnant. There's nothing more embarrassing than that. But of course there is a big difference between, sperm and eggs and whether or not sex is about pleasure or law. I mean, who should be teaching 12-year-olds about that? Nobody.
Yeah, and Eileen, I mean, LGB Alliance have done a lot of work on disassociating the T from the LGB, because it is obviously a completely different thing. Yeah. And particularly looking, as you said, at Stonewall, who, again, were in pretty much, I mean, however many schools they were, at the height of their kind of, they were in thousands of schools. What do you think?
Well, I think that the Tories badly need to wean themselves off Stonewall. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been amazing. I mean, they really are no longer the great charity they once were, and the former founders of Stonewall, many of the founders of LGB Alliance, they forced, what Stonewall does, as you know probably, but they force-teamed LGB with the TQI without consulting anyone, and then they said, there's no debate, because to debate is to hate trans people. I mean, it was a complete, utter nonsense. And the capturing of our institutions, from civil service, all of it, schools, is almost totally down to Stonewall and the likes of Mermaids. And I don't know, there's lots of other Mermaids charities, there's all sorts. They all got kind wee kiddie names, all sorts, and cute things, and they go into schools and they say everyone's got a gender identity. It's these groups that have been allowed into schools that have got, because the big problem now I think the governments, both governments really now see there's a problem, but for 20 years that embeddedness has been going on. Now I think the other thing, because Miriam said the Tory government, the reason they got it wrong a bit was they abandoned conservative principles, but I think there is a great book that Gareth Roberts wrote saying that actually they're riven with guilt about Section 28. Now, that was 40 years ago, and the Act was only there for 16 years in the statute books, and no one was ever prosecuted. It was the worst law in the world. But it's used now all the time by the press saying, this is the new Section 28. Yeah. It's a nonsense. And transphobia now is nothing like the homophobia of the past. And gay rights, we didn't ask everyone to believe anything that we believed. We didn't ask for women's rights to be stripped from them, or kids. We didn't ask for any of that. All we said, please can let us be our own and not be discriminated against. Thank you very much, you allowed us to do it. And so I think that the problem really is Stonewall, Mermaids and all these groups that are allowed in. And the other problem is the grooming of children online. That's really serious, because by the time they get to schools, and the damage has been done. But I do think let's not do Stonewall, let's do LGB Alliance.
Okay, thank you. I am going to open up to questions. There's lots of them. I will go for the gentleman here in the green shirt, please.
Back in the 80s, my wife was a school governor in Lambeth, and literature was going around at that particular time which was sympathetic to those who were paedophiles, and it's been supported by different politicians, because what they did with it is they were equating those who love children with those who love people of the same sex. Now, where I was kind of given hope is that what happened is, after a while, people began to make a distinction between, if you like, protecting children and the whole thing of adult rights, in terms of sexual rights. Now, what's given me hope is the CAS report to focus upon children, and my feeling is that to go for this whole thing of identification is a very difficult case to kind of put forward, because it affects adults, but to focus on protecting children, I think, should be the main area of attack. And I think what's given me hope is the fact that it moved, because we just couldn't believe it. School governor and the district go around encouraging people to support paedophiles. That's back in the 80s. Now it's changed now since then, but change happened because of the focus upon protecting children. I just feel the argument should really focus upon protecting children first, rather than adults. And I think the problem has been is if you try to hit both cases, what happens, they get confused and people start saying about it's going to affect people identify. and I think it should be about children first.
Yeah,
So that's my
okay.
feeling. So I don't know what you think about that, but that's something we should focus on, is the children.
I think children are generally in politics a wedge issue, you know, more generally. Fuchsia, what do you think about that? I mean, you're
I think it's absolutely correct. I mean, because we've got to remember that the children who are being impacted are the same group of children that the paedophiles targeted. I mean, it's very well known from all the safeguarding case reviews that the characteristics that paedophiles tend to go for. They will probably know a child is autistic before that child has any diagnosis or the parents picked up. They can spot the vulnerability. It's like a predator looking for the weak animal apart from the pack. And it's all the same characteristics. And I'm really glad that you brought it up, I mean, which is why I did when I was saying, you know, that they've gone from the paedophiles kind of forced team themselves with the gay rights movement, and then, you know, and it's just, and then we have then with the kind of the Islamists, and then now we have this whole thing where it's like transphobia to call out kind of effectively what is child predation. And it's not always sexual, sometimes it's just kind of extreme political activism, which can be equally kind of dangerous. And we as a group, as Basil, we've brought out a document called Safeguarding Trans-Identified Children and Adolescents, where we identify all the key safeguarding areas. But what we found was very interesting was how much similarity there is between the factors which prevent use is a definition of radicalisation. And it's just, I mean, incredibly, I mean, and again, the prevent criteria recognises the very specific vulnerabilities and, you know, trauma backgrounds and, you know, I mean, and also, I mean, autism is there as well. And so I just think it's about recognising that that particular vulnerable group of children, or children who've been very badly bullied for being same-sex attracted or feel different from that, they don't fit in with their peers. If you've got a strong peer group, that normally that's a very protective factor. So anyone who's apart from that, and it's just recognising that group of children will always be vulnerable to somehow being predated on, and that is why it's so important to. That's why I was kind of very strong about the safeguarding culture will recognise that, and recognise people coming in suddenly telling them that 2 + 2 = 5, and this time it's different, and being alert to that being a red flag for they're trying to circumnavigate all the strong policies that we have in place to protect the vulnerable children.
And
Just very,
yes.
sorry.
Like the cat. Would you like to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say, aside from the paedophile issue, because I think you're really correct about that, it's important that Cass pointed out that of the children who presented themselves to GIDS, the surgery, 89% of the girls and 81% of the boys presenting described themselves as homosexual or bisexual. So we're talking about a group of vulnerable children here, they're distressed, and so what we're really doing in these surgeries is medicalising children who would probably end up being gay or lesbian and giving them medicine to change their sex. I mean, I just can't think of anything that's more disturbing than that. And that's why it's such a big issue for the LGBT Alliance, because we don't ever say a gay kid or a lesbian kid. Kids are kids. But these kids, probably their trauma, it seems from the Cass report, they'll just end up being happy lesbians, gays and bisexuals, and that's a terrible scandal for the gay community, and one that Stonewall will not even recognise.
Yeah. Okay, more questions. I'll go to Christine.
You may or may not know, but there's a competition for who's going to be leader next. And I'd really like to know from the panel which of the leaders, maybe there's several, they think will safeguard our children and our grandchildren most. Because I can't think of anything more important.
I might as well start with Maya.
I'm not going to comment on particular leaders, but you should ask them, will they make the Equality Act clear? That's the question I would ask them.
I would agree with Maya on that in terms of, well, just in terms of asking the questions about all the issues that we've been discussing. Just ask them, like, do they, you know, what do they understand about safeguarding frameworks? I mean, how do they feel about being able to say a hard no and set boundaries? Or, as as Miriam said, repeal the laws that are actually undermining the protection of the most vulnerable in society. Because if they're not prepared to take those hard steps that are needed to do that, then those people will continue to be harmed. Children will continue to be harmed. There has been no, and they are still being harmed on the ground. There is not really that much that's changing. Because people escalate when you don't put in a firm boundary and say no.
Yeah, as a charity, we're not really allowed to back any particular candidate. But I think, again, it's asking the questions. I think one candidate said, oh, the culture wars, it's a rabbit, down a rabbit hole, which basically was dismissing it. And other candidates have said it's a very important issue. So I think I'll leave it to you to work out which is which. But it's about just, is it important to them? Is it important to them? And then I think you'll find the right answer.
I'm also going to duck the question. I think, well, I'll say this. The only person I've never heard speak about this or take it seriously is James Cleverly, so I'll leave that there. But I don't think it is just about what they say, because words are cheap. And it's easy to stand up now that people can see the way the wind is blowing, and say, sex matters, men and women should be different, we believe in women's spaces. But the question is, what will you do? And I think the last government proved that words are just not enough. You have to have a strategy. You have to surround yourself with people who share your vision and values. You have to have a grip over the different departments to push things through. And you have to have a party that's united around an agenda that would repeal, let's say, the GRA. And none of those things are going to be evident next week, the week after, even in a year. But what we're looking for is someone who's strategic enough to be able to build a platform, a legislative agenda that can hit the ground running on this and many other issues. And I have my personal feelings about who might be able to do that, but for many, many reasons, I'm staying publicly neutral.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to take questions in groups because we've not got loads of time left. So there's a gentleman at the back there.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Kemi is clearly the one that has a rock-solid track record. I'll just put that out there. Can I thank Miriam and Baroness Jenkin for the work that they have done over the last few years in bringing this to the fore? But as a Conservative Party member since I was 18, can I also say, why are there not more gay men in the Conservative Party speaking out about this? So I'm old enough to remember when LGBT Conservative, I don't think there are any more letters at the moment, LGBT Conservative used to be called LGBT Tory, and it got piled on social media, and within a second they decided to add the T and then Conservative, going back to Stonewall and the pile-on. And so organisations just fold. Why are not more gay men, do you think, in the Conservative Party doing what Baroness Jenkin and Miriam have done?
Right.
So I'm going to take another question. This lady here who provided the tunnocks. Thank you.
Okay. Should local authorities have red lines for safeguarding at family-friendly pride events that they organise? For example, would it be appropriate to wear a penis-revealing outfit or a pup mask? In Darlington, the council allowed both. They endorsed them on their social media accounts, and they refused to let a member of the public raise their concerns at a council meeting on Thursday.
Okay, thank you. And I'll take one more. There's a lady over here in a black flowery dress. Oh, sorry, I'm making you run on the way.
Thank you. And just following on from what Leigh just said, can you give us any advice for people who are going for local elections in May, who currently sit on council, who perhaps would like to go forward for to become an MP? What advice would you have for us to get more involved? How can we bring sound, common sense advice to committee meetings and not feel like we're going to come under fire and be called homophobic or transphobic?
Thank you. Okay, I'll go to our panellists. Maya, do you want to come in on those? So,
yes, I'll come in particularly on the last one. You can say my name, it works quite well. I think it's really important that local councillors and candidates bring common sense to the fore, because a lot of these issues are decided and governed at a local level, you can use the Forstater judgment. So this is the judgment which found that the belief that sex is real, immutable and important, which is just the standard everyday belief that, you know, most of your constituents of all parties believe this, is protected under the Equality Act, but also lack of belief. So people who have never heard any of this stuff and they just have the ordinary belief that men are male and women are female are also protected against discrimination. And I have had counsellors come up to me today saying, you know, they have complaints against them and they've been able to stand up to them because they have used the Equality Act. So that's one thing. And then the other one is, I want to make the case for the public sector equality duty. The Conservatives should embrace it. The thing about the public sector equality duty is it says that public bodies must not unlawfully discriminate, and when they set their policies, they have to think about people with protected characteristics. Everyone has protected characteristics. People often think people with protected characteristics are like a special group, but everyone in this room has protected characteristics. You all have an age, you all have race, you all have a sex, you all have a sexual orientation, and those things are protected. There's no hierarchy of those things. And the reason why there is a public sector equality duty is to constrain the power of the state, because private entities they also shouldn't discriminate, but they're freer to do what they want, whereas the state is using public money, it's you know, forcing you to do certain things, and so it should think about how that affects everybody. And so actually I think the public sector equality duty can be used to bring back common sense. It's a way of saying, don't just think about this very small group and what they want. You have to think about everybody when you're setting a policy about how you collect data, how you organise changing rooms, how you organise prisons. You have to think about all men, all women, everybody with all protected characteristics. And I think it helps rather than hinders.
Okay, thank you. Fuchsia, I'll come to you.
I would say with the councils, my local council is quite interesting because they have very much, I have heard anecdotally from a school panel that I attended, taken on the new safeguarding framework update for children to recognise that means there is a significant risk of exploitation of trans-identified children. So I would recognise that councils themselves have quite a big role to play in duty of care, especially if the council themselves has got a responsibility for the local schools in kind of making sure that they're up to date with all the CAS review, like the specific training that the CAS review has gone out, and helping schools themselves inform their staff via inset days or specific training on safeguarding around this area, that it's that the things have changed. It's not what they thought, not necessarily what they thought it was, and a lot of the people they've had in were activists versus experts, and that they have now a responsibility to listen to what, you know, most recent data, and that councils can help with that.
Miriam, on the why are not more gay Conservative speaking out on this? What do you think on that?
Good question. I mean, there are a lot of gay men in the Conservative Party. I think we're the gayest parliamentary party in the gayest parliament in the world, or something. We were anyway before July. I mean, there are some. I mean, I can make some guesses. A lot of gay men don't have children. I think this is an issue that really starts to bite when you see how your own children are affected by the ideology, or in the worst case, you've had children that have been deeply affected by this. So I think that's probably a case. I think there's a natural linking of it, particularly older gay men who experienced terrible homophobia in the 80s. They think this is the next battle. They think they're protecting children in the way that they wish they had been protected. So I think those are two very fair explanations. I think there's some also other explanations about links with Stonewall's, another group. And also there's huge social pressure. Yes, there are lots of LGBT people who do not want to be forced teened with the T, as Eileen so eloquently put it. But there are other gay men who very much are in Team T and are taking part in these pride festivals that clearly aren't suitable for children, etc. So just like with anybody, you can't say just because somebody's gay, they're on one side of this issue or not. But I think a big part of it is just not having contact with children who are at school, and therefore just not being on the coalface and seeing how this is affecting children. But it would be great if that changed.
And Eileen, do you want to come in on any of those questions or points?
Well, I'm not qualified in the councils, and except I think it's absolutely outrageous that these parades are allowed to go. So sexualisation of children, and I just think, how could councils like that happen? Gay MPs, well, I don't think we've got one now friendly lesbian or gay MP in Parliament that supports LGBT Alliance openly, and that's a problem. But we're working and going around. I think what Miriam's explanation, I think, was spot on about the friends. And you talk to the gay men and say, oh, I've got trans friends, I don't want to hurt them. And they just don't really understand the clashes and the difficulties. And everyone likes trans people. I've got no objection to trans people at all, but there's clashes of rights, but they won't recognise that. But we're working on it, that's all I'll say about that. We're working on the gay MPs.
We haven't got much time left. I do want to just pass over quickly to Baroness Jenkin of Kennington in the audience, whose work within the Conservative Party has been phenomenal, although she doesn't ever take any credit for it. But Anne,
thank you. And actually, well, I mean, everybody in this room has played their part as getting us to where we have got to. But I would just like to make two political points, if you like. One is that Paul Burstow went straight from being a Liberal Democrat health minister to chair the Tavistock. I don't believe that was a coincidence. And not everybody here will know that the company that makes the puberty blockers, Ferring, made a very, very substantial donation to the Liberal Democrats. And you probably also see that, so they are completely captured, that Shara Ali, who was deputy leader of the Greens, not only took them to court and won a substantial amount of money for them, but they expelled him yesterday for his gender-critical views. So, I mean, we are the only game in town when it comes to this. And just when it comes to the lady's point about the councillors, there is... so I'd just like to introduce Caroline Fisk, who's standing at the back in the green trousers. So she runs Conservative for Women. Please, I can do a shout-out to support them, to get on their mailing list, support them financially if you can too, because like everybody else, they live on our shoestring. But there is a Conservative councillors group, which I encourage you to join, and Caroline will be able to link you up with that. And just on the MP's point, before the election, we had over 60-something active Conservatives involved and interested in this topic, which crashed to 8 overnight. We've built that back up. Every one of the leadership candidates has signed up to the group. But I just encourage you, if you have still got a Conservative MP, to please lobby them. As Maya said, they had an extremely successful lobby day a couple of weeks ago, and quite a few Conservative MPs, in as much as we got any left, were helpful, and they will be helpful, but some of them need to be educated. So please lobby them, put them in touch with me because I'm the manager of the lists and many other things. And just to thank you all for your interest, and we were a bit nervous that people wouldn't come, but here you all are. So thank you for coming, and thank you to everybody on the panel as well. Lottie, do round up.
I think we will...
Sorry, Lottie, can we just have a quick round of applause for Rose Dapper?
Yeah. Of course, yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reminding. And on that note, we will close. But thank you for joining us, and do come and speak to the panelists afterwards. Thank you.